Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 to 16, Bible study script KJV. Today, we continue our journey through the book of Genesis, and we now arrive at Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 through 16. To understand this passage clearly, we must connect it with the broader biblical story. In Genesis chapter 12, God called Abram and promised him three things: a land, a nation, and a blessing to all nations. In Genesis chapter 15, God reaffirmed his covenant and promised Abram a son, an heir from his own body. Yet time passed, years went by, and still Abram and Sarai had no child. Genesis 16 begins in the tension between God's promise and human impatience. Let us now enter the text and explore its historical background, Hebrew perspective, theological meaning, and deep spiritual lessons. 1. Historical and cultural background. Genesis 16 takes place in the ancient Near Eastern world around 2000 BC. In that culture, having children, especially sons, was essential for survival, inheritance, and family legacy. For a woman, barrenness was not merely a personal sorrow. It was considered a social shame, and even interpreted as a sign of divine disfavor. Sarai, Abram's wife, had lived for decades without a child. She was now advanced in age, likely well beyond normal childbearing years. In the ancient customs of Mesopotamia and Canaan, it was culturally acceptable for a barren wife to give her maidservant to her husband to bear children on her behalf. The child born through the servant would legally belong to the wife. This cultural practice forms the background of Genesis 16. 2. Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 to 3, Human Solution versus God's Promise. The passage begins, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar." Here we meet Hagar, an Egyptian servant. She was likely acquired during Abram and Sarai's stay in Egypt. Recorded in Genesis 12. Sarai speaks to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid." Notice something very important. Sarai acknowledges God, but misinterprets his timing. Instead of waiting for God's promise to unfold, she assumes God has permanently prevented her from bearing children. So she proposes a human solution. Abram listens to Sarai and agrees. This moment echoes Genesis 3. Just as Adam listened to Eve and acted outside God's command, Abram listens to Sarai and acts outside God's timing. From a Hebrew narrative perspective, this passage shows a recurring biblical theme: human effort attempting to accomplish divine promise. 3. Genesis chapter 16, verses 4 to 6. Conflict and consequences. Hagar conceives, and immediately tension arises. When she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. In Hebrew thought, conception elevated a woman's status. Hagar, once a servant, now carries Abram's child. She begins to look down on Sarai. Sarai becomes bitter and blames Abram. "My wrong be upon thee." Abram responds by giving Sarai authority over Hagar. Sarai deals harshly with Hagar, and Hagar flees into the wilderness. Here we see the painful result of acting outside God's will. A decision born from impatience leads to jealousy, division, and suffering. Theologically, this passage teaches a profound truth. When we try to fulfill God's promises through human strength alone, we often create unnecessary pain. 4. Genesis chapter 16, verses 7 to 10. The angel of the Lord appears. In the wilderness, something extraordinary happens. The angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness. This is the first time in Scripture where the angel of the Lord appears. In many theological interpretations, this figure is seen as a manifestation of God himself, a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. God meets Hagar, a foreign servant, alone and pregnant in the desert. This reveals a powerful spiritual truth. God sees not only patriarchs and prophets, but also the forgotten and oppressed. The angel tells Hagar to return and submit to Sarai, but he also gives her a promise: "I will multiply thy seed exceedingly." Even though Ishmael is not the child of covenant promise, God still blesses him. God's mercy extends beyond the covenant line. 5. Genesis chapter 16, verses 11 to 12, the birth of Ishmael. The angel instructs Hagar, "Thou shalt call his name Ishmael." The name Ishmael in Hebrew means God hears. This name is deeply significant. God heard the cry of a suffering servant in the wilderness. Ishmael is described as a wild man whose life would be marked by conflict and independence. Historically and biblically, Ishmael becomes the ancestor of many desert tribes. This moment reminds us that even when human choices complicate God's plan, God remains sovereign and compassionate. 6. Genesis chapter 16, verses 13 to 16. El Roi, the God who sees. Hagar responds with one of the most beautiful confessions in Scripture. She calls the Lord, "Thou God seest me." In Hebrew, El Roi, the God who sees. Hagar becomes the first person in the Bible to give God this name. She realizes that even in the wilderness, abandoned and suffering, she is not unseen. God sees her. God hears her. God speaks to her. Abram is 86 years old when Ishmael is born. But God's covenant promise through Sarah is still yet to come. Genesis 16 ends with tension unresolved. Human effort has produced Ishmael, but God's promise will come later through Isaac. 7. Spiritual and theological lessons. This chapter teaches us several deep spiritual truths. First, God's promises require faith and patience. When we try to force God's timing, we often create conflict and sorrow. Second, God is compassionate even in our mistakes. Though Abram and Sarai acted in impatience, God did not abandon them. Third, God sees the unseen. Hagar's story reminds us that God cares deeply for the rejected, the lonely, and the broken. Fourth, God's plans cannot be replaced by human effort. Ishmael was born through human strategy, but Isaac would be born through divine promise. Finally, God is El Roi, the God who sees you. He sees your waiting. He sees your struggles. He sees your prayers. Even in the wilderness seasons of life, God is present and working. Closing reflection. As we meditate on Genesis 16, let us remember, wait for God's timing, trust in God's promise, and rest in the assurance that the God who saw Hagar also sees you today. He is the God who hears. He is the God who sees. He is the God who fulfills His word. Thank you.